You may have heard of critical race theory. I mean, it's always in the news. But you may not know that actually started out as a phrase among lawyers. So what I thought I'd do is give you a little brief overview of the history of the concept, and then next time it does crop up on the news, you can sort of go, well, actually. Um, so it all starts with something we call jurisprudence. And jurisprudence is the study of the philosophy of law. So it's not so much about learning individual laws, it's about, the law as a concept, how a law's formulated, how a law's enforced, all that sort of thing, how, different legal systems. And among theories, there's something called American realism. And I mean, I've mentioned this before, but American realists, they said, well, you don't look at like the black letter law, the statutes and the case law and everything that's written down to establish what is the law. You look at how the law is actually enforced in practice. So to give my example before, what's the speed limit on a motorway? Officially, it's 70 miles an hour. Will you be prosecuted if you do 72 miles an hour or 73 miles an hour? No, of course you won't. You can drive past a police car at sort of like 75 miles an hour and nobody's going to bat an eyelid. I mean, as I mentioned, we know that the speed cameras down here, for instance, are set 81 miles an hour on the A30, even though the speed limit is 70. So American realists would say the speed limit is actually 80 miles an hour because that's what's actually going to happen in practice. I mean, we actually have this sort of baked into some laws. For instance, the drink drive limit is 35 in breath, but they don't prosecute you unless it hits 40. So again, that's something where even the law says one thing, but even officially how it's practiced says another. So American realists, like I say, they say, right, let's look at the law in practice. Now, some people said, well, that's okay, but you need to look at what factors affect how the law is enforced. And some people called critical theorists, they were from a sort of Marxist background, so they tended to look at everything in terms of, economics and finance and status. And what they said is, well, look, rich people and poor people aren't treated the same by the law. I mean, there's that famous old, phrase that the law, in its impartial, majestic impartiality, forbids the rich and poor alike from begging in the street, sleeping under bridges, and stealing bread. And they would say, to go back to our speeding example, they'd say, well, if you just, punish speeding by fines, then for people who can afford to pay the fines, speeding's legal. You just pay it off, and that's why we introduce points to sort of make it make it fair for everybody. That was the theory behind that, anyway. Um, so they said like look at all those sorts of factors, and then some other people came along and said, well, yeah, finance and economics is one thing to look at, but there's also things like race. How does race affect this? And this is where critical race theory comes in. And again, to give the example, American realists say, well, the speed limit is, what is actually enforced. Critical theorists say, yes, well, but speed limit is, if you can afford to pay the fine, then it's different for you. And critical race theories would say, well, you need to look at who actually gets pulled for speeding in the first place and see if there's anything disproportionate in that. So that's how it started. So it wasn't, it wasn't so much setting out and saying, here is, what is actually happening. It said, here are factors we can look at, and these are things that we need to investigate in terms of, how the law is enforced. So that's critical race theory. Now it's been sort of, adopted. Perhaps it's got a wider meaning, or the meaning is being misused. But effectively, it's just saying, one factor you can look at when examining how society works is the impact of race. So there you go. Another interesting one, just to throw this in and pad this out a bit. Political correctness actually started out as just a boring legal phrase. Started out in the US Supreme Court, and they just used it to mean, were you actually getting the description right? So it's probably easy to give you an example. So in America, to refer to the national government is politically incorrect. But, because it's the federal government. So you say the federal government, and then you are being politically correct because you're describing the actual political system. And that's all gone out the window now because, of course, we have things like NASA, which is the National Aeronautics and Space Agency. But there was always this big thing at the, start of America that they didn't like the idea that it was national. They do, we don't like to use the national word. We are a series of, independent states and commonwealths and territories, and we just happen to have a federal government that sits, parallel to that. So there you go. Hope you found that interesting. And like I say, next time you're in the pub and something like this crops up on the news, you can say, well, actually, did you know critical race theory is a legal thing? Oh yeah, if you found that vaguely useful or interesting, please consider clicking the like button, sharing and subscribing.